Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar brought to you by the Canadian Professional Sales Association. Please note that you've been placed on mute for the duration of this webinar. You may participate throughout the webinar and ask questions during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar using the Ask Question function in your GoToWebinar dashboard. Hosting today's webinar is Chris Champagne. Chris Champagne is a bilingual sales transformation specialist and sales coach. He has a proven history of developing strong relationships within all aspects of the ecosystem, from customer to partner to manufacturer. Chris has over 25 years of experience in the IT industry, including the role of Vice President Partners and Channels at Hewlett-Packard Enterprise Canada. His company, Champagne Consulting Group, was established in 2005. Chris has delivered sales academy programs in Canada and around the world, and his one-on-one coaching with executives, sales managers, and frontline sellers has direct impact on bottom-line results. Now, without further ado, I'll hand it over to Chris.
Thanks very much, Kate. Welcome, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde pour celui-là qui sont à Montréal. Welcome, everyone from coast to coast on today's webinar. Really excited to spend the next 90 minutes or so with you around a very important topic of how to become better prospectors, ideally to drive more pipeline, to drive more success for you in your business. Let's take a quick peek at our learner outcomes for today in terms of the things that we're hoping you'll get out of today's session. Number one, better position yourselves to confidently succeed in the prospecting process. Number two, guide conversations and provide recommendations based on information that's gathered, including things like trends and challenges happening within industry. Third, create client personas and independently generate a list of sources for acquiring prospects. Apply simple data analysis to focus on the prize, creating net new business. And lastly, create a competitive displacement mindset and having that top of mind as you push through the no's ultimately to get to the yes. Walk you through today's agenda in terms of the topics that we're going to be covering as part of our webinar today. Understanding your company, the market, and your clients. Understanding really what are your competitive advantages, and doing things like a SWOT to understand what are the things that are doing well within your organization that clients are resonating with, product or service, and also how to obtain feedback from clients you're already working with today on the benefits that they recognize on the products or services that you're providing to them. We'll take some time also to look at the ideal client analysis and how you bring your ideal client profile to life through the actions that you would drive through your prospecting process. And then we'll take a deeper dive into the prospecting funnel, a good visual to look at in terms of how clients move through the funnel from top to ultimately becoming customers, and all the work in between that will be the work that's required to win new business. And then we'll also take time to look at return on time invested, ROTI. Probably one of the most impactful ways to look at your business is justifying where you're spending your time and how you're spending your time. And then we'll also look at closing ratios. Some of the best ultra performers in sales today know their numbers, and your ability to focus on getting to yes and not being discouraged by the no's, ultimately leading to new business, which leads to the power of no. And stay tuned. I'll provide a little bit more content on that as we get through our webinar today, and really a different mindset, a different approach to how to handle the prospecting process. And then prioritizing your prospecting funnel. How do you look at your funnel and segment A, B, C, A being your most important prospects, best opportunity, B's having an opportunity to be able to acquire new business, products or services you're providing, and C's those that potentially are smaller, but could also be a potential for your product or service. And lastly, we'll finish with a call to action, some recommended next steps to take to help you on your path to prospecting success. Now, if this was Chris Champagne up in front of you delivering a facilitation in a CPSA public class or corporate on-site program, I'd ask for your feedback. Is today's agenda compelling to you? Anything else to add or change? but in the spirit of time, Kate will roll forward. Understanding your company, the market, and your clients. Kind of starting first with really understanding what your company's goals are, and aligning your personal sales goals to the company goals is critical to your long-term success, thereby providing you with the ability to have perhaps larger goals as well as smaller attainable goals as you work on the path to prospecting for a net new business. So important questions you would ask yourself as you go through this process. What are your company's sales goals? What are your company's prospecting goals? How many net new customers does your company need to achieve these targets? And really asking yourself, why do you think being able to answer these questions will benefit you and your prospecting success? And kind of a visual to walk you through this is, think about the planning pyramid that's introduced in the CPSA Fundamental of Selling course, as well as the Strategic Account Management course. Think about the strategic initiatives that your organization is focused on today. And as an example, one of the clients I work with together with CPSA, this is really important. And aligning the strategic priorities of the business, of which profitable growth is one, that's important as it's aligned to the clients that you choose to target that are in line with the company's strategic priorities. So keeping that in mind helps keep focus in terms of which clients to be calling and working with, ideally, and also influencing the call plan in terms of the questions and who it is you're actually looking to prospect and grow with. Aligning to the company's purpose in terms of the strategic priorities and how that plays out in the real world in terms of clients and prospecting is really important and will enable focus. Secondly, working on your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Working on building a SWOT with your clients, with your target clients, after you've done the work of your own internal work. So being able to better understand what things for you within your organization in terms of the things that are working well and focusing on those, and also being mindful of weaknesses, things that potentially could create competitive advantage for you as you look at your competition and the way that they're winning into the market. So things to be aware of in terms of your SWOT would be things like, what do you do better than anyone else? What unique or low-cost resources can you draw upon that others can't? What do people in your market see as your strength? And part of a good way to obtain this feedback is think about customers that have obtained your products today. How are they benefiting? What's the outcome for them? What factors mean to you that ultimately get the sale? How actually do you walk a client through an experience with you that ultimately gets them excited through a prospecting initiative, first call, that actually can lead ultimately to getting that new business? And then also things like your UVP. What's your unique value proposition, and how can you articulate that in the way that is aligned to the client's business? And then looking at weaknesses. What are some things potentially that could be improved? What things should be avoided? Important things to keep in mind that would not be part of your language in terms of prospecting for new business. And then opportunities. What opportunities can you spot in the marketplace? What trends are happening in the marketplace potentially that you could be taking advantage of? And just to underline that key point in terms of trends, one of the ways that prospectors are the most successful today is they know what's happening in the market within their industry, and they're able to bring their customers insights, ideas in terms of what's happening within their business, and ideally, how they solve them, most importantly, that would give them a reason why they should sit down and spend 15, 20, 30 minutes with you to help them in their business. And then lastly, threats. What are the things within your business that you face in terms of obstacles? What are things happening in the competitive marketplace where perhaps there's a new incumbent in the market and they're gathering market share quickly? Some things to keep in mind there as well. And then competitive SWOT. Maybe looking at one competitor in particular and what advantages do you have compared to that competitor, An example that I would share with you and why this is important is one of the clients with CPSA that we're working with, they're taking great time through an investment in a fundamental of selling program. And one of the elements that's really important is actually what is different versus the competition, and actually being able to articulate the value proposition that differentiates them versus other competitors. And a tangible way to actually do that, and kind of the purpose to make that happen, is actually looking at one competitor specifically and identifying what are the things that you do differently. By way of an example, looking at a competitor and identifying things like a go-to-market around e-commerce, potentially, having an online system, 24/7, providing access to price and inventory, using an app on your iPhone perhaps to order inventory right then and there. Things like that provide competitive advantage. And if those are things that you're doing differently from your competitors, those are things to be focused on. And then last point, as it relates to competitive SWOT, is having the process of recognizing what things are strengths within your organization actually pumps you up, because these are the things that actually we're doing differently in the marketplace. It's actually going through the process of the SWOT, kind of the light bulb lighting, if you can imagine that light bulb moment of an idea perhaps that's validated through winning new business that you can then maximize and use that for other opportunities. And then research. Some of the best ultra performers use data to help them through initial client conversations. Research on trends like industry, financial, technology potentially, legislation, regulation changes, things that you're aware of as almost like a company's second brain. You're thinking of things that are impacting your client's business that ultimately you can help them with. And unless you don't bring those things to the table, it's a generic conversation around price. And your ability to differentiate yourself starts with understanding what's happening in your marketplace. And just by way of an example, one of the clients that we work with at CPSA are very focused in the plumbing industry. And part of the way that they're trying to differentiate themselves is bringing ideas to their clients that can help differentiate them in the marketplace. So just by way of data, did some analysis on the trends that are happening in 2018 in the plumbing industry. And trend number one was you can't rely on low pricing to differentiate yourself from your competition. So how is that relevant? When you work with clients, really thinking about the problems that they're having in their business and your ability to then articulate to them how you solve them and understanding what some of those challenges are can separate yourself from another salesperson who's trying just to get a meeting for the purpose of them selling their own products. Switching the mindset to understanding industry and understanding trends and providing value upfront first in terms of those ideas can be a game changer and a differentiator for you in your market. And then lastly, building your ideal client list for the past 2 years and what are the ideal profit analysis? Where does the client, by way of their description in terms of their spend, perhaps, in the products that you sell or services that are very strategic to them? Therefore, you then need to build the list and prioritize who you're going to be contacting as part of those first steps in getting out of the prospecting gate. So taking a little bit of time now to understand who is your ideal client, who are the target clients that you're going to have in terms of your prospect list. So things like who is your ideal client? If the ideal client is different than your expectations, how do you go about perhaps looking for clients that maybe aren't natural in terms of what's on the radar screen, and sometimes just doing a little bit of a Google research on companies that are taking advantage of the product or services you deliver is really important. And also, who is not your ideal client? Comes back to return on time invested. Salespeople have hope. Part of our optimistic nature is believing that a client will want to do business with us. However, when do you decide when hope is not a strategy? And focusing on a process by which you determine when to cut bait and when to move on is important as you take your valuable time to prospect and go after new business, perhaps targeting a specific client that's just not interested because they have a locked-in contract relationship with another client could be a reason not to have would be actually a very good reason through a return on time invested analysis to show that client, unfortunately, is not going to be the best one for you. So how do you bring your ideal client to life? What things should you be aware of in terms of the thought process around being able to create new business? And how do you complete your ideal client profile based on what you've learned from your analysis? And based on that and what's happening in the industry, what insights can you bring to your ideal clients that will get their attention versus, hi, it's Chris Champagne from Champagne Consulting. Can I get a meeting with you for next week, Tuesday morning at 9:30? I have some really interesting product information to share with you regarding what's happening in your industry. And I'll share with you perhaps a different approach as we move through our presentation today that perhaps will get a client's attention in a different way that really positions you as bringing some ideas and value to your clients. So things to be looking for: getting feedback from existing clients. What product or services are you providing to them? And ultimately, what's the outcome? Could be cost saving, could be competitive differentiation that's leading to new business for them, revenue generating activities around the product or services that provide good profit for them in terms of contributing to the bottom line. What industries are growing? And just did a quick Google search in terms of our prep for our session today. If you just Googled 2019 trends in Canada, what are the top 5 growing industries in Canada? You might be interested to know, and maybe not surprised to know, the number 1 growing industry for Canada in 2019 is cannabis production. Number 2, e-commerce. Think of the Amazon effect. Think of the last time a brown Amazon box arrived on your porch that maybe your 22-year-old or your 24-year-old, because I have 2 of them, those boxes are showing up often on my front door. Thankfully, they're covering the bill on those, so all that works out well. But the impact of Amazon is significant and a major disruptor in business that's impacting not just the industries that they're playing in today, but where is the next Amazon impact coming in business. And another trend in terms of where business is, industries that are growing, is storage and warehouse leasing, and specifically self-storage. We're in a very consumption-based economy, and businesses like leasing of storage and space is the 3rd fastest growing, or is predicted to be the 3rd fastest growing industry in Canada in 2019. All that took was a 5-minute search. And to be able to obtain information on industry and where industries that are growing, think about return on time invested again, really narrows the focus in terms of where you should be spending your time. So taking some time to look at the prospecting funnel. What are the things that you should be looking at in terms of the visual, in terms of mapping your prospecting funnel, and looking at the target market as the first consideration in terms of what people and companies might need the services that you provide, and kind of leveraging that initial trend information that I shared with you regarding the plumbing industry. That in this example potentially is our target market. So which companies would you target in that case? Well, potentially could be contractors, could be municipalities, could be utilities. That would be your defined target market. And then as you work your way through the funnel, ultimately through your first contacts, you're considering who would be the suspects, who would be those within the target market that are within your range in terms of reaching out to potential existing clients today that are using your product or services and you'd be looking potentially with a complementary player, potentially could be one that you could reach out to. And then thirdly, in terms of the prospects, these are the ones that you've already contacted, had initial meetings with, and are now perhaps a little bit more interested in what you have to say because your value proposition is resonating with them, that ultimately can lead to becoming a hot one, a prospect that ultimately is looking at your proposal, and then you're using your good negotiation and closing skills to be able to bring them across the line. Ultimately, looking at the proposal and really differentiating what you're bringing to the table. And a quick tip in terms of this final proposal that you're delivering to clients, part of the work that I do with organizations and with leaders in particular is understanding first, what are the client needs that you're solving? Then delivering the proposal in terms of what you solve for them in terms of those business problems. And lining up for those that deliver final presentations via PowerPoint, be able to identify those needs first and understanding and making sure that the client sees that you understand what their needs are, and having that being understood as you've done your work, you've kind of validated what the needs were, then you can be able to provide what the medication is, or the solution, if you will, using the kind of doctor analogy of what's wrong with the patient and acknowledging that, and then what's the medicine, the solution, ideally, to help them get better and produce better results. That stage, that final stage before the hot one becomes a customer, that's close ratio. And we're going to talk about closing ratio shortly in terms of knowing your numbers and how important that is to the process. Next topic, return on time invested. And as I mentioned earlier, salespeople have hope. And as a wise sales leader once told me, hope is not a strategy. So how do you counter hope? You counter it with logic. And this process in terms of return on time invested is critical to understanding who it is you're targeting, how much time in terms of an hour a week, 2 hours a week perhaps, and calculating the actual expected gross profit that prospect could yield, using those two, your profit target as well as the time that will be required to capture that new business. That's the formula for return on time invested. And I can share with you firsthand, those that participate specifically in the CPSA Fundamental of Selling course, and now ultimately through the Mastery program and the Mastering Prospecting program with CPSA, this potentially has the opportunity to be a game changer for you as you really view the time that it takes to obtain new business, and being very focused in a more scientific way, if you will, in terms of the process, that in terms of the time that it takes to be able to acquire the business. How many calls, how many face-to-face meetings, how many proposals, how many quotes ultimately can lead to new business, and all the research that's required for you as well in that specific client that's going to determine if that's something that's viable for you. So as an example, determine which prospects offer the best financial viability, and maybe there's some opportunities that the return on time invested is not good, and that you need to determine perhaps after 10 calls, maybe the opportunity with that client is not going to materialize. And knowing the recognition of time being our most precious asset, being very analytical, but also focused on where the upside could be, and maybe isn't with a customer that unfortunately just isn't resonating with what it is that you're bringing to the table. So you have two choices: change the pitch or change the time in terms of where you're going to focus on other opportunities. Next, closing ratios. And one that hits home well to me is I really resonate, and I have to be honest, this was not a strength initially of spray and pray in terms of working with, trying to target many customers as part of the prospecting process. But what is the research that you need to do in terms of your average order size, as an example? What's that look like for you? How many new sales do you need each year to reach your goal? And that's also aligned ultimately to what the corporate goals are, and then what's your piece of that. And then ultimately it keeps you focused on the process and ultimately keep you focused on the prize. So as we walk through a little bit of math together, and this is hard work. I'm not for a second going to think this is something that perhaps this afternoon you're going to take some time to put this together, because it does require some research. But as often shared with me in the CPSA programs, specifically the fundamental selling program, is if you don't know your numbers, it's hard to really recognize where improvement will come from. So this is kind of the baseline, if you will, of the math, of understanding your sales goal. So by way of this example, perhaps your goal for the year is $1 million of revenue, or perhaps it's $1 million of profit, depending on your organization. In this example, we'll consider it as revenue. What's your average sale in acquiring net new business? What does that look like for you? And trying to put a number around that. In this case, we'll use 15,000 as our example. And then how many in terms of number of new leads would you need to ultimately, given your average order size of $15,000, get to your target of $1 million? So in this case, you'd need 76 transactions ultimately to get to that $1 million target. And then in terms of the proposals that you would deliver and convert, what does that look like? In this case, a pretty good ratio of conversion in terms of 3 to 1, in terms of proposal to sales ratio. And then in terms of number of new proposals needed, well, how many of those ultimately would you need based on that proposal to win ratio? In this case, we would need 200 proposals to make that happen. And as you gasp for your breath, as you think about the number of proposals required to actually deliver the revenue that's required, it might seem like a big number. It really depends on your industry and your service, certainly, but perhaps a bit of an eye-opener in terms of the actual number of proposals you need to deliver that ultimately, based on your win rate, will contribute to achieving the target. And if perhaps you're looking at this in an optimistic point of view, if you have a proposal to sales ratio of 3 to 1 and the number of proposals created is 200, well, what if, with a little sharpening of your prospecting skills, and hopefully we're giving you a few of those today, ultimately that can become 2 to 1. And what's that impact on your numbers in terms of the number of proposals? Would be less. Looking at the number of contracts to new proposals, what's that ratio look like for you? How many, in terms of building to that final proposal, do you need ultimately to win? Well, in terms of the number of contacts, the number of contacts that you would require within an organization, think about the decision influence group, think about the champion, think about the advisor, the user, and never forget the final advisor, because they're the one that can trump you at the end. Ultimately, how many contacts do you need in order to convert to net new business? So by way of an example, contacts needed per month in this case would be 34 contacts, would ultimately be required to generate the number of proposals, to generate the number of contracts, and then ultimately to the net new business. Just to pause for a moment on the number of contacts. Obviously, LinkedIn is a gift in terms of the sales process. That information is more tangibly available today than ever. A company's website, perhaps, doing a little bit of research on who the executive team is potentially, but who is, you can introduce some new language, who is the CEO of the problem? Who owns the problem that you're trying to solve? With your product or service, identifying who that key influencer is. Maybe it's a user, or perhaps it's an advisor that would recommend your solution. Really gets to the heart of what is it in terms of value and insight you can bring to an organization, and understanding who, and maybe it's not the C-suite, and maybe it's a bit of a different point of view in today's selling, that naturally we're coached to go high, work the C-suite first, ultimately, for them to say yes to interest, who then gives us support to go meet with a director level or perhaps a mid-level manager. Bit of a different spin on who's the CEO of the issue that ultimately you help solve. That would be the champion in terms of the decision influence group that you would target. And ultimately having 2 or 3 individuals within the organization, depending how deep they are, ultimately would be the ones that you would want to get first meetings with. Because if there's a significant problem or issue that a mid-level manager is trying to solve today, perhaps they're your best contact. And understanding that they ultimately can get success and maybe recognition internally for how you're going to make them look good by solving a business pain that they have today, ultimately can help you earn credibility with that customer. And here's an interesting way to look at the power of no. Getting closer to yes. I'm going to walk you through a bit of a different twist in terms of how you look at the no in terms of a prospecting call that, unfortunately, call 1 didn't result in interest. However, if you consider your average order size, in this case, as $10,000, and when you get to the win, that's the result. Well, if the first customer that you called was not interested, if you look at it through the rest of the example that I'll walk you through, it actually has a value. Second customer you called, still not interested. Third customer you called, still not interested. Fourth customer you called. Now, most people, and I know everyone that's on the call today are not most people bail at call 4. Roughly 75% of salespeople, after 4 calls, if they're not getting a yes, they're out. But we're not that group here today. We're digging in. We're making call number 5. Still not interested. You're not giving up. You're still digging in. Call 7, call 6, call 7, call 8, call 9, still not interested. Aha. Call 10. Finally, you get a customer that agrees to meet with you. If your average order size is $10,000, and if you do the math tells you that the no, as you work your way through to call 10, you're getting closer to yes. So the no, in fact, has a value. And if you focus in a more positive mindset or optimistic mindset that the no's are actually getting you closer to your yes, a bit of a twist on the resiliency that's required of salespeople to continue to push through if and only if you know your numbers. Knowing your numbers and knowing what your number of call to first meeting ratio is, ultimately are going to help you drive greater success and keep you in a more optimistic or positive point of view because you're focused on the outcome and you're determined to get there.
So we actually have a question come in from Catlin. She said, is the call to the same customer 10 times or different customer prospects?
Great question. This example is calling the same customer. My correction. If I was to call Kate and I was to call Chris or I was to call Catherine, this would be all different calls. And each one would have said, no, well, I'm going to be consistent and keep calling different customers. Also, I think by way of an example, this could be other individuals within the same organization. That if you're not getting the yes, that ultimately you would keep working potentially, depending on how big the company was, others within the organization. But by way of this example, this would be calling one new customer after the other, trying to get to the yes. Great question, and thank you for the opportunity to qualify that one a little bit. So moving to the next stage in terms of the prospecting, prioritizing the prospecting funnel. Which suspects will you prioritize? And do you need to increase, and where would you need to increase your focus in terms of your calling efforts? And just by way of an example, when you would consider an A or a B or a C prospect, or maybe even to use the medallion language, a platinum customer, a platinum or an A customer in terms of a suspect would be one that would have the greatest spend for the product or service that you would deliver today, and how ultimately the product or service that you're providing, how does that help them in their business, and really prioritizing by the total available market for your product or service would kind of be those A or those platinum-like prospects. And then step two would be, who's the next level in terms of total dollar spend for your category, for your products or services, ultimately that clients could benefit from. And then C, these are clients who would be a little bit smaller, their spend is less, however, important to keep them on your radar screen because we need to get runners on first base, and we need to get runners hitting singles. We'll need to hit some doubles too. The Jays home opener, being based in Toronto, where we are, is coming up shortly. So keeping in mind, we need to bring all the runners around the bases. We're going to hit home runs, which is great, but getting our suspects to prospects, getting runners on base, also ultimately we can bring them around if we're hitting single after single after single, which also then ultimately contribute to bringing in net new business. And then looking at which prospects will you prioritize in terms of that next stage. And this potentially is a return on time invested discussion you would have with yourself in terms of, now that you've converted, you've met with them, how are they now resonating with what you have to offer? And is there a clear desire to be able to take it to the next step in terms of an actual proposal? And using things like consultative investigation, step 4 of the 8-step consultative selling process. For those that have participated in the Fundamental of Selling program, you probably knew that question top of mind before I even brought it to you, that's an important part of understanding client needs after you've done good things like building rapport and actually shown up and had an agenda and thought about what the purpose of meetings would be for the prospects that you're meeting with. But this is the next stage that you would determine, is there a good fit? And how much time will it take you ultimately to be able to convert to a hot one potentially? How many of those would you need? And kind of doing the math through each of these stages to ultimately determine a customer at the end of the day, and working it backwards in terms of number of net new customers, and use the example that we walked through in terms of closing ratio, and knowing your math really help keep you focused on your best opportunity for having a good return on time invested. And then to break it down just a little bit further, looking at our prospecting funnel and our client list. So looking at the spreadsheet, and I'll preface this with, based on experience, those that get to this point, that actually take time to identify where each prospect is in the cycle, from suspect to prospect to hot one, this is something that takes time to do. And the common challenge is that I hear from salespeople, I don't have enough time to do this. The question is, what's your close rate? How many calls does it take you to get a first meeting? What's your win rate in terms of conversion? What's that look like? And if you could sharpen skills like understanding your unique value proposition, providing good information about insights and trends, those things will help differentiate you, that ultimately these names then line up in terms of what your spreadsheet would look like in terms of the companies that you've been targeting. What is your return on time invested? So you've done the math. What are the products or services potentially that line up with your product or services? And then what's the estimated value? And being honest, salespeople are very bullish and have sometimes high expectations of what the estimated value of a client is. So being very real about what that opportunity could be, revenue or profit. And then any notes. What type of activity is required with decision makers? Who are you engaged with? And who's that next contact potentially that you'll be working with? And then the next step in terms of the prospects. What do they look like? What's the return on time invested look like for them? So you've actually taken time to assess that in terms of the amount of time required, an hour a week, 2 hours a week potentially in terms of client engagement, and then determining if your return on time invested is low. So in this case with Quantum Inc., the ROT at 2 could be an indicator to you that you're putting too much time into the opportunity. Perhaps it's time to shift and perhaps look at Smitty's North as a potential client that your ROT is just a little bit higher, as well as what the potential profit or revenue opportunity is with that client. And then lastly, at conversion time, you've gone through the process of providing a final proposal to them. You've walked them through it. You're very clear about what the needs are, but perhaps there's some resistance. Perhaps there's others within the decision influence group that are not on board, and the amount of time that's going to be required to actually bring it across the line, as tough as it is at that stage, and perhaps you might resonate with opportunities that you have in your pipeline that you forecasted as a win, that you forecasted as a close. Ultimately, this was going to happen next month, only to find out it was pushed. And then you're on that weekly forecast call with your manager. I've been there on both sides, so I can relate to the story that you had to share. Unfortunately, the deal got pushed, and it got pushed the next quarter. Well, when is it going to be time to cut bait on that opportunity so it doesn't show up on the forecast sheet and your sales manager, your sales leader is looking at you going, that one's been on there a little too frequently. What are you doing to actually make this one across the line? And maybe the answer is, you know what, I've invested enough time in this. Doesn't look like there's a path to revenue here. I'm actually going to pull this one off my forecast, and I'm going to look at the other two potentially that are in the prospect stage to put more of your precious time into. So this, again, it takes time. It takes time to know your numbers. It takes time to kind of look at this. Maybe you have a CRM. Maybe you're using Microsoft Dynamics. Maybe you're using Salesforce potentially, that have a way to automate where you are in the sales process. And using that actually to help you in terms of productivity ultimately will help better use your time and how you're spending it in the field. So I'm going to catch my breath, take a sip of water, and see what questions you might have in terms of the prospecting process and what challenges you might have as part of your current prospecting process that maybe we can give you some tips and guidance on to help that process become more productive for you. So very interested to hear, not if you have questions, what questions do you have we may be able to provide you some guidance with. So Kate, let me know when questions start to come in, and look forward to providing some coaching kind of live in terms of maybe some challenges you're having as part of your prospecting process that perhaps we can help you with. And this, by the way, is the active listening moment where we're pausing, having asked the question, although I am interrupting your thought process, but probing to trying to see if we have some questions that we might be able to help you with. While we wait for a few questions to come in, I'll answer some of the most common questions that come to me in terms of the prospecting process. And the one that's that comes the most often actually is being able to get that first meeting. And oftentimes taking time through research, through understanding what's on a client's website, understanding what's on their LinkedIn profile, understanding trends and industry that ultimately can then point you in a more focused way in terms of who those clients are. Oftentimes not having success on that first call, sometimes as a result of not doing research and providing education in terms of what trends are happening in business today. And by way of another example, actually, in my inbox this morning, I got an email from Selling Power magazine, which, by the way, CPSA has a partnership in working with Selling Power magazine. So if you're interested, perhaps a follow-up email to Kate to maybe follow up with a little bit more about how you can leverage the partnership with Selling Power. But what I received in my inbox was, what are the 5 trends around development in terms of sales skills companies are considering in 2019, and where are their gaps? Well, very relevant to me as I try to get my handle around what those common challenges are. But for you, in the context of your business, maybe just taking 15 minutes. It's a Google search. Trends happening in your specific industry. What are the top 5? That's a starting point. Step 2 would be in terms of what it is that your company does to address the trend, and where is the risk with clients that you can then elevate in a first client conversation that would go something like this. Hey, Kate, it's Chris Champagne from Champagne Consulting. I have an opportunity to share some information with you regarding some of the trends that are specifically happening in the training business. And certainly understanding that personal productivity in terms of being able to improve someone's skills is important. I've done some research around what some of these trends are. And if you have perhaps 30 minutes next week, I could drop by and share some of the research that I've been doing, as well provide you with some answers based on what we're doing within our organization that potentially might be of interest to you. Do you have 15 to 20 minutes next Tuesday at 9:30 by chance?
Certainly.
And ultimately increasing the likelihood that you're going to have success by being just a little bit more specific in terms of the trends that are happening in business, that perhaps instead of a traditional cold call that's just asking for time for you to sell your stuff. Yes, ultimately you want to get there. However, the path to getting clients' interest is what's important to them. And the more that you can put yourself in the shoes of your customers, in that mindset of that second brain that I mentioned earlier, that you're bringing ideas around trends and the impact and insights, ideally you're differentiating yourself from others who are trying to get meetings with your clients.
So that's actually a great lead in. Praveen has asked, could you share some tips on prospecting call content and elevator pitch to avoid rejection?
So there was one that we just walked through together. I guess the add to that would be knowing what your unique value proposition is. And part of the fundamental of selling program, and as well through the prospecting program with CPSA Advanced Prospecting, is developing that UVP. And kind of the elements that are contained in that is first understanding a bit from the SWOT. What are your strengths? What are the things that you do well that differentiate you in the marketplace, and what's resonating with clients today? What benefit are they getting in terms of using your product or services? And then looking at what the competition is doing and being mindful of not having a commodity discussion about same product or services, but what it is that you do differently. And perhaps most importantly, the what's in it for you, the benefit. So part of the unique value proposition is that last piece, the proposition. It's the what's in it for you. And the what's in it for you potentially is obtaining a competitive advantage in your market by obtaining our product or services because of innovation maybe you're bringing to the market. It could be cost reduction. Maybe it's, you play in the technology space. And you're bringing a better value proposition to the client in terms of cost savings around infrastructure potentially that you're able to bring a very strong what's in it for you of 20 to 30% cost reduction based on implementing your solution, and that's something that you would tie together as part of your unique value proposition. But just focusing on the things that you do different and using it in a way that would resonate with who your CEO of the problem is as a way to try and get their attention.
Okay, so Danielle has asked, in our industry, we get prospects that call us that are already hot. They have an urgent problem that they need us to solve and are ready to buy, but it doesn't always mean that we as a company want to take those clients. We would say 90% of prospects that come to us are not our ideal client. What would be the best way to manage that precious time? They are immediately ready to buy, but they take away from working our ideal clients and prospect list.
Yeah, great question. I think part of it would be to be able to diagnose in a very efficient way through asking good questions, good consultative investigation in terms of the urgency to act in terms of the problem that the client would have today, and perhaps questions like in terms of the need that they have within your product or service, where are they in their decision-making process? Is it step one? Are they just looking for information? Is it step two? They're looking at information and there's actually a problem. And is it a 911? Is what they're looking for today something that they're looking to make a decision on? So a little bit about time frame. Have you had some thoughts about what the time frame would look like in terms of making a decision about the product or service that you would be interested in? And also asking questions like, who, in terms of the request that a client would have, this is something that's top of mind with you. You know, who else within the industry potentially have you looked at in terms of potential competition, but not calling out a competitor by name, but just to get an idea of what their process has been before they actually called you. And then perhaps asking a question about, you know, the criteria that they would use in terms of their decision-making process. What are the 2 or 3 things that would be important to you as you go about to make this decision, which if a client had a good answer in terms of they thought through their process, then that would be an indication maybe that's one to spend time with. If they haven't and they don't have answers to what's the decision-making criteria, that also might be a clue that you're right, that perhaps that would be a bad ROTI, bad return on time invested. And perhaps another piece to that could be also in terms of the decision influence group, in terms of others that are involved in your organization as it relates to this project, how meaningful is that? And are there others that are involved in making decisions in terms of this particular project? So some quick thoughts there in terms of some questions potentially to ask.
Perfect. So Caitlin's asked, in my industry, cost seems to be the deciding factor for many customers, but how do I approach the customer with providing competitive pricing without knowing what they're currently paying? Is there a way to ask for this information to provide a cost reduction without the customer thinking we are just pricing to get the sale?
Yeah, great question, and it's got return on time invested written all over it in terms of getting to the price equation, which is always part of the equation for sure in terms of clients wanting to save money, and looking at cost is sometimes the best way to make that happen. And I would kind of preface my approach would be, I appreciate that getting to the most competitive price, so kind of playing this out, I would appreciate just asking a few questions if I could in terms of your business and the priority for this project and the actual pain that your request has triggered. Could you walk me through a little bit of what the problem is you're trying to solve? And how important is that? Is there a timeline around associated? But I tried to get to the heart of the matter in terms of what the need is. And can you walk me through a little bit about what this request for pricing was driven from? Because if you're able to share with me a little bit about kind of what pain has resulted in this request, maybe there's some things that we bring to the table today that just aren't on the surface that I can bring to your attention, which you could benefit from. And could you spend perhaps 5 minutes just walking me through what the need was. And then that perhaps could set you up for asking a few more questions, but then as well, there needs to be a win in it for the client, and perhaps inserting in your unique value proposition to the client would help them see the value of working with you versus shopping for price. I would add one more key point. If you decide that you're going to follow through and provide pricing, my next question to the client would be, based on the quotation or proposal that I've provided to you, could you spend 15 minutes on Friday at 9:30 for me to actually walk you through my quote and give you an opportunity to see what questions you might have in terms of that quote, and maybe there's some objections that might come out that you could actually answer for them, which would save them time in the long run. So part of the process in handling a client who's so price conscious, sometimes the answer is to provide them with the quote, but then when they provide you with the time to actually have you walk them through it. It's been shared with me with one student in particular in the Fundamental of Selling class who knew his close ratio like the back of his hand. It was 37.5%, he shared with me. However, by asking for an opportunity to walk through a proposal, once he completed it and the client gave him time, his close rate went up to 55%. So he did the work, put the proposal together, but then the client would commit time to have them walk them through what the proposal would look like. And if the client wouldn't commit to providing the time, then unfortunately they didn't see the value by spending the time with you for whatever reason. Perhaps the value proposition wasn't strong enough, or they were just shopping for a third quote, which we know happens, and maybe then it's time to cut bait on that particular opportunity. Hopefully that provides some insight in terms of that question, because it's a common one for sure. No more questions. Come on, team. There's more challenges you can throw our way here. I'm curious to hear your most complicated prospecting challenges. Maybe we provide a little bit of light on perhaps what some of those challenges are that we've been able to provide some context for you for. Okay. Well, maybe in terms of one last prospecting tip for you in terms of your process. And it underlines one of the items that we've talked about, and that was doing your homework. One caution, analysis paralysis can cause you heartburn by taking too much time to prepare. Giving yourself enough time to gather the relevant information around industry, around trends, knowing your unique value proposition, knowing what your close ratio is, knowing where they are within the funnel, all of those things are important. But it starts with doing the research and then the action, picking up the phone and providing that first call and having the courage with some good points underneath you in terms of a script that, once practiced enough, become familiar for you, will increase the likelihood of getting to yes, and having the determination to know your numbers and thinking of the power of the no that ultimately gets you to yes. But give yourself enough time to research, but then have the courage to actually pick up the phone. And perhaps a final tip would be in terms of actually then sending a follow-up email to that prospect, or maybe it's a LinkedIn in-mail as a follow-up to your voicemail that you left, because your voicemail likely will not be returned. You need to provide another level of communication, and either an email or a LinkedIn in-mail, putting in what your trend is that you're looking to address, and ultimately some research that you've done to help address that trend, not talking about product that you're trying to sell, and the time that you're available to meet, and proposing that as a kind of next step in the process around that first prospecting call, following up with a good crisp email.
So we had another question come in. It says, where do you go to find your ideal client? What resources are most commonly used?
Yeah, great question. So in terms of the process, step one what is it that your existing clients, what is their industry in terms of their vertical perhaps, that they're getting benefit from the product or solution that you're providing. So maybe step one is understanding what your value proposition is from your existing clients, and maybe that's talking with other salespeople, other sales leaders, product managers potentially would be step one in terms of understanding the more vertical focus in terms of where your product or services would be the best fit, and getting some win stories under your belt in terms of social evidence, in terms of what problems you're helping solve for that particular industry or vertical. So the information to gather could be internal, step one. Step two would be then hopping up on LinkedIn, looking at particular industry, and then getting a little closer to what companies would fall under that particular vertical. So if it was finance as an example, what are the tier one insurance providers? Who are the tier two? Who are the tier three insurance providers? Who potentially could be some contacts after you've done a LinkedIn search on that group, and then looking at the different individuals within LinkedIn that, based on client success of where you're winning business today, who are the CEO of the problem people who are on that LinkedIn kind of level? Who are the mid-level managers? Who would be administrators potentially? Who would be vice presidents of marketing potentially if it's a more data type solution that you're looking to drive? And then putting together your call campaign in terms of the number of customers. Let's say, as an example, you've built a list of 60 prospects. Who are the A's, the platinums, who are the B's, who are the C's, and then more focused in terms of starting to make those actual calls.
Perfect.
Hope that helps.
Okay. Well, if there's no further questions, on behalf of the CPSA, I'd like to thank Chris and, of course, our audience for attending and asking great questions. If you'd like a recording of the webinar, it will be available in the CPSA Learning Hub. And if you have any questions at all, please feel free to email me at salessuccess@cpsa.com.
Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate your time. Good selling.